When countries go to war, they usually put a lot of energy into creating narratives that will benefit their cause. As we've seen, Israel is certainly no exception. We've heard stories about beheaded babies, burned babies, and Israeli women being raped by Hamas militants. Much of the so-called evidence for these stories, which turned out to be fabricated, came from Zaka, an Israeli rescue and recovery organization. But according to investigative journalist David Sheen, an Israeli colonel played a big role in creating some of the false stories that Israel has put out and that have been repeated by Western media outlets.
In addition to Zaka, well, first of all, we have to ask how Zaka even got there to begin with. Why were they on the scene when, in fact, it was the Israeli army who were in charge of the entire region at that point, which was essentially under occupation by, Palestinian resistance groups, Hamas and others on that day. So how was it that they got invited? And they were invited by the head, the chief, the commander of the Israeli army's rescue squad. And in fact, the commander of that rescue squad, Colonel Golan Vach, who's been feted around the world by heads of state, including multiple Muslim heads of state, because he's always at the head of the Israeli teams that are sent to help out when there's natural disasters. So he's got accolades from all around the world. He's perhaps the best known Israeli soldier, the most recognized face of the Israeli army, or what they would prefer to have as their face of the Israeli army.
And what exactly did he do in this situation?
This high-ranking colonel, who was responsible for the collection of corpses on October 7th, he was the one who stayed the order, who said, no, we're not going to bring in the units of soldiers that were especially trained for this task, that went through rigorous training in order to prepare them for the horrific job of collection of corpses after a battle. Instead of bringing in those professionals trained to do so by the army, he was the one who brought in the Zaka team of people who are not prepared and people who already have a religious bias, an ideological bias. And in fact, Colonel Vach shared that bias because he did not come out of nowhere. It turns out he's got a long sordid backstory of his own. He was born in Hebron in Kiryat Arba and raised there. His father was the mayor of Kiryat Arba. When his father was elected to become mayor of Kiryat Arba, the first thing he did was sign an edict that forbade any commerce with companies that hired non-Jews. Okay, this man, from his infancy, suckled at the teat of anti-Arab racism, to say the very least. And, it's been long an agenda of the Jewish far right to infiltrate the highest orders of power in government and academia, and of course in the army. Golan Vach is a premier example of this. He got to, this really high rank, and then he was at the right place at the right time. And at this really critical juncture, when there were hundreds of Israeli dead civilians scattered throughout the region around Gaza Strip, and his job was to collect those corpses. Not only did he bring in, these amateurs, these ideologically, opinionated amateurs to do the corpse collection, but he himself invented the worst of these atrocity hoaxes, specifically the ones that involved beheaded babies and burned babies.
That's investigative reporter David Sheen.